Swasan and I are super thrilled to have another deeply meaningful and truly life affirming conversation with Coach Jim Johnson. What we are going to talk about today is as a coach for young boys in the high school system and a keynote speaker in the leadership space, and as a man who's been married for a very, very long time. Jim knows and actually lives the experience of a man who speaks less, who drives impact, does more, right? And that is the reality of how men of a certain generation were raised. Mm-hmm. But the young people he's coaching are being raised by younger generation mothers who are raising them a little different. Mm-hmm. And so this is going to be a wonderful conversation about what does it feel to build a safe place and a space for men of multiple generations to freely communicate and not just talk about sports and weather, but truly have deeply meaningful conversations so that the mental health and the overall wellness is also preserved and men don't feel like I have to figure this all out on my own. Right. So Jim, welcome to the Man Space, and I am thrilled. As we get started, talk to us about being a married man in a long, happy marriage. Wives always tell the husbands, right? Certain things. I am the wife in a long marriage, married to an old American gentleman, right? So it's pretty much related. Let's hear from your perspective, from the male perspective. What does that look and feel like?
Yeah, it's interesting because I read a book many years ago, Men Are from Mars and Women Are from Venus, and that really opened my eyes because now I've been married, happily. I'd say majority of the time, although my wife sometimes would have a challenge on that. But we have been married for 41 years, and we have a really good relationship. We were fortunate to have one son as well. So, but in my journey of really trying to learn, because I was a high school basketball coach, a head coach for 30 years, is trying to learn how to be a better leader. I coach mostly young men, but I also had an opportunity to raise a son with my wife. And really, as I learned more about being a leader of myself and then the leader of others, is that it really works in all aspects of life. It's not just working as a leader in whether it's business or in my case, coaching basketball teams, but also on how you work with your family. I did an engagement yesterday and they asked me about building relationships. I said, well, I've had 41 years of practice working with my wife, the ups and downs. And because one of the things I talked about is finding passion in something you love. But often when you get passionate about something, it becomes an obsession if you really want to be good in something. Well, when it becomes an obsession, then it ends up taking a lot of your time. And that struggles, often you see that with building relationships at home. So like one of the things I shared yesterday was I got better. I'm still not perfect by any means, of sharing my schedule to my wife each day, and her having a really expectation of where I needed to be, where I was, what time was I going to be at home, because I was part of an event, where I had a young man that shocked the world. He scored 20 points in 4 minutes. He's on the autism spectrum. And you talk about media attention for about 2 or 3 weeks. And I remember we went through some real stress because we had never gone through that. The phone was literally ringing off the hook. And I'll never forget one day, I still tell it as part of one of my keynotes, is I was supposed to be home at 3 o'clock and I got home at 5 o'clock. And the phone had been literally ringing off. And I'll never forget because my wife actually had all these names and numbers. She yelled at me, "Where have you been?" She threw the papers at me and said, "I'm not your secretary." But it's something that always made an impact for me, because where I've really felt I've improved is if I know I'm not going to be on time for something with, my relationships. And that's how I try to build relationships, is I got to make sure that I reach out and contact, say, honey, I know I was supposed to be home at 3. I got caught up. I'm not going to be home until 3:30. So those are things that are really valuable in building relationships, is having clarity of communication. I heard this comment, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, is that clear communication is kindness. And when people are unclear, and people are unsure, that's where you really get strife in relationships, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, that's very valid point. And Dr. Cass, thank you. I love these types of conversations, these types of topics, because I always learn, what I come across all kinds of men and women, from different fields, different backgrounds, and I love hearing different types of stories, and being in a coaching space as well, and hearing someone being married for 41 successful years, and obviously it just doesn't happen out of thin air. It takes time, right? It just, you grow and you learn, being a basketball coach, being a husband and so on. So there are things in life, I've been there as well, right? Went through a divorce and learned my lesson. So that's why I love hearing, like, when you talk about communications. And for us men, it's so hard to communicate, because you know what, 4 or 5 years ago, I didn't know how to properly communicate. Right. But now, hey, with investing in myself and so on. So I actually ask for help, from other coach to help me, because so that's the thing. What I want to ask you, if for the men out there that are listening to us, that are in marriages, that are in maybe dating relationships, what can they do, right, to improve their communications with their partners? What are some of the weaknesses that you see in young men these days? How is it different, from when you were growing up?
Well, the first thing that always jumps out to me is the phone. uh, and the fact that people, if you're really going to show that you care, the number one thing is you got to show your attention. And I always laugh. I tell a story. I was over at my brother's house a few years ago, and my niece was graduating from high school. And I was walking out, and there was 5 or 6 girls or her friends in like this sunroom. And her name was Jamie, and said, "Hi, Jamie, we're leaving." And I laughed because I looked, and there's 6 girls in there, and they're like 17, 18 years old. And not one of them was talking to each other. They probably were texting each other because they were all on their cell phones. So I think the one thing is understanding the different generations. I'll give you a quick illustration. Like when I started, when the phone became very big, I used to want to call my players. Well, most of them don't like to be called. They didn't want to pick up the phone. But if you texted them, they would immediately respond. So again, just getting clarity with the different generations of how they want to be communicated. And then the second thing that I think is hugely important is curiosity. And I think if you're going to continue to build a relationship, one of the things I share with people that are trying to be leaders is be the chief question asker. And what I mean by that is really ask questions and get to know and build relationships. And after you ask the question, then you need to stop and just listen, and then get clarity. When they say a response, make sure that you're on the same page with them. We used to do little exercises with players. I'll give you an example. We used to ask our players to get to know them better, and we would do it in team meetings. If we really knew you, and then we'd ask them to share something. Well, often what we would do to build some rapport is we'd have them do it in partners. And then one partner then would share what they learned about their teammate in front of the whole team. So that's a good way to teach them how to listen to each other, and then also to communicate with the team. So we're all getting to know each other. So I think, really asking questions and having that curiosity is hugely important in building positive relationship.
I am delighted to hear you talk through the different ways people communicate. So the young people will sit next to each other as a couple and they will text each other.
Right.
And I ask them, why do you do that? And they say, if we talk, we will fight. So the underlying issues are still not resolved. They've developed a coping mechanism, but they haven't transformed. So I asked that with the intention of you being a coach and working with basketball players and being a coach and coaching executives. How can we help men get past those workarounds and truly deal with the elephant in the room?
But the first thing is I really encourage leaders because you have a great point. The elephant in the room is so many people want to avoid that elephant and think it's going to go away. And believe me, it does not. And one thing that I really evolved, because I was one of those people early in my leadership career where I kept thinking the elephant was going to go away. And if you don't address that elephant, it only is going to magnify and get worse. So I think the thing I really encourage people is that you need to be willing to address the elephant, but also have the empathy of really trying to get to know what the issue is from the other person's perspective. Because often we start to accuse, like you're always late, but really find out. And that's why building relationships and getting to know your people is so important, whether it's personal relationship like a marriage or a leader working with his players on his team or in business, the people that they work with. And I think when you have a mindset that we're working together, not necessarily that you play for me, but we work together. I'm real big into servant leadership, so I really encourage leaders to flip that pyramid. And the pyramid is how can I serve the people that I lead? And I think when you get that mindset, and no matter what relationships, is how can I enhance this relationship? And really starts with empathy. And the fact that, there's times that you've got to be humble and, that you don't have all the answers. And I know that changed my leadership and my marriage when I realized that although I feel like I'm a lifelong learner, I don't have all the answers. And often you need to find the answers by asking questions, being curious, and then being empathetic and really delving in to get their perspective before you share your ideas.
No, I love that because as you're speaking, I'm thinking about myself, where I have been, in my marriage, and last year I actually volunteered to coach my son, which he was a seventh grader, basketball team as well, and I did not have anything, no knowledge. Yeah, I watched NBA on TV, but how to call plays, how set up offense, defense. So I had a coach that I was assisting, that I was helping with, that he coached other teams as well. So that helped me a lot. But you know what? I learned, that right now the generation of the young men, from what I have seen, like on Tuesdays at 7:15 we would have practices, and Saturdays we would have games. And what I have noticed too, that there was a lack of commitment, lack of dedication, right? That they would not be all in. They would just treat it as, hey, whatever. So, what would you, tell fathers out there that have young boys that are in sports, about, dedication, about commitment? Because, that was the issue that we had, that players would not show up in practice, right? They would come late to a game, half asleep, this and that, right? To me, it was a little bit unacceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing is it is getting to know your people so that you make sure that they really enjoy, because if you're playing a sport, which I coached for a number of years, they should enjoy it. If they feel like they're forced to do it, then they're probably in it for the wrong reason. So I think first of all, getting to know their motivation of why they play the sport. Then the second thing I always teach leaders is, as a leader, you got to be a chief storyteller, not only ask a lot of questions, but you got to be sharing stories like, so I built this program on stories of successes and failures of both players we had in our program. And like you said, you look at the NBA, I would often come in and share, hey, so and so, how come he's a really good player, but his team always loses? And then we would have a conversation about that. And then we, bring up another player and say, how come this guy is a very good player also, and his team always wins? What's the difference? So you're trying to teach them stories. And the same thing is you get illustrations that you can share in your own life, with players we worked with that, I call them warnings and examples. Warnings are the people that didn't do a very good job, and the examples are people that did a really good job. And I think as a leader, you have to share those stories of both warnings and examples so they have something to base. So understanding how they can be successful if they have a real passion. In my case, and you mentioned your son playing basketball. So because a great side little illustration is we have one son. I was a basketball coach for 35 years. Do you think I wanted my son to play basketball? I did. You know what? He did. He played until middle school. He didn't like it. So, but the one thing I really learned, and this is a great thing for all men, is observing fathers and mothers that you think do a really good job and what are their characteristics. And then some of the fathers, especially, that they were trying to live through their son. And I learned, I said, you know what? I want my son to be successful, but he doesn't have to be a successful basketball player. And I'm proud to say he was a straight A student. He's an attorney now. He's doing quite well, but he had nothing to do with basketball. He just didn't like it. So I think that's a real good lesson for all of us.
That is such an important point you're stressing, Jim, because when we have unfulfilled dreams, it's human nature to want your children to live it because you think you failed and you want them to be successful. Comes from a good place, but the entire approach is wrong. As we raise children and as we coach and mentor and guide young men, how can we help them be open to feeling and talking about feelings? Because fundamentally, as humans, we are feeling creatures who have the capacity to think. We're not thinking creatures who sometimes happen to feel, right?
Yeah.
So accepting who we are, fundamentally who we are, how are we going to continue to help and groom young men to grow up differently than our generational men? Because that is so important for their mental health and their overall well-being and life success.
Well, I think the first thing is, as simple as this is, I think you need to be a really good model for the young men. So, like a couple things, like we call them non-negotiables. You mentioned that, you have players coming not on time. Well, that was a non-negotiable. That was not acceptable, and there was a consequence for that. But again, as a leader, I was always on time, because if that was a non-negotiable that I was sharing, then I better be a great example for that. Like I expected my players to be in shape, so I kept myself in shape. Now, not all, that's just a belief I have, because my mission was to be an outstanding role model for my young people. So that really became very, very important to me. Then the second piece for me is really understanding that the times are always changing. Like I did bring up the cell phone, but initially my wife would always say, Jim, you got to learn how to text. That's what the younger generation is doing. Now I text all the time. And she was right. So you have to get into the world. And also the last thing, talk about feelings, is the adult, the leader, you got to be willing to be vulnerable. When you make mistakes, you got to be willing to admit it and share. I'll give you a quick story. So I mentioned quickly that I had a young man, Jason McElwain, that was our team manager, and he got into our final whole game and he scored 20 points. But what a lot of people don't know is earlier in the season, we had a terrible event where it divided the team. And for any of us that have been on a team divided, you probably realize that you're not going to reach your potential. And I'll never forget, I went to a practice because we were playing horribly, and we didn't even bring a basketball up. I sat in the bleachers, And I got very vulnerable and I shocked him. I said, guys, because we were going to go to play a game that night and it was a day off of school. So we had an hour of practice. And I said, but I don't have the answers. You do. And you got to be willing to share on how we can unite this team. And it seemed like 5 minutes was probably 30 seconds. Then finally, one of the players shared an idea. And then somebody else shared an idea. And by the end of the practice, we never brought a basketball out. But it changed our season. We ended up playing a great game that night, and it really gave us some momentum. We realized that if we didn't unite, we were not going to reach our potential. So I think it's a really huge thing as a person that, if you want to help them with their feelings, you got to be willing to be vulnerable and share your feelings as well.
Yeah, that's phenomenal wisdom. Thank you, Jim, for sharing that. I always learn something, from individuals like yourself, and that is so true, right? And many times is like you look everything. Hey, being on time, being a great leader, it all starts with us, right? Being a role model. Hey, whether it's to our sons, to our daughters out there, and helping, being, like you said, being vulnerable as well, being open and vulnerable, and that that leads to communication, in relationship and just so on. It's just small, simple techniques or methods, right, that you can apply in your marriage, and on sports team with your players, with your employees, right, building team as a leader. And they're so powerful. And like you said, becoming vulnerable as well. Like, we don't have all the answers. Like, players, employees, we do. What can we do to help and transform us to get to the next level?
Yeah, absolutely. Well said.
Thank you.
So look, it's so funny. Time flies when we are having impactful conversation. So before we lose our opportunity to get information from you, how can our audience get a hold of you, reach out to you, connect with you? Anything you have to share, and then we will also make sure it is included in the release.
Sure, sounds good. So the easiest way, I have a website called coachjimjohnson.com. That way I wouldn't forget it. And on that, I do have a lot of free materials. I have a monthly newsletter that you can sign up for free. I do a weekly blog for free. I have a video series on YouTube at Coach Jim Johnson. I also am part of we started a podcast a couple years ago called the Limitless Leadership Lounge. And our focus is to help young and emerging leaders. And the reason I did that is because I became a head coach at 25 years old. We won one game and they fired me. And so I was one of these arrogant 25-year-olds that realized that I had a lot to learn about leadership. And so this is a way that I want to give back. And I do have a book about the story called A Coach in a Miracle. And certainly I do a lot of different presentations to help people with their team and leadership and inspiration. So
thank you so much, Jim. It has been an absolute delight and an honor. You and I go way back, but I am so happy that you joined Marcin and I for this conversation. And there's nothing like having the wisdom of an older, happily married gentleman to bring that perspective of relationship on top of the coaching of the young people and coaching of executives. So you were able to help us thread the needle to have that multi-pronged, multi-situational, multi-generational conversation. Thank you. Thank you for that.
my pleasure. It was an honor. I enjoyed it immensely.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Cass. Thank you, Jim. I will connect with you as well, because I already have a couple people that I would love to introduce you as well.
Sure.
I would love to, talk to you a little bit more offline as well, learn from
Sure.
you, because like I said, you are a phenomenal individual with many years of experience, lots of wisdom that, that will help me as well. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. I'd love to continue.
To our audience out there, if you're a mother raising sons, make sure you take some of these nuggets of wisdom and raise them in a way that their mental health, their holistic wellness, and their ability to feel, acknowledge that feeling, and talk about feelings are addressed, so that when they grow up to become men, they truly are in a better place. And for fathers and gentlemen out there, executive men who are running organizations, take a moment and step out of what feels safe for you and go into that space of feeling and sit with it to figure out how you can authentically show up without masking your feelings so that you can truly be in personal and professional relationships in the real sense of the word. Being in a relationship is an emotional journey. It's not an intellectual one. It's not life is not a thought experiment. Life is a lived experience, and living requires feeling. So to the gentleman out there, you are doing great in fulfilling your role, but hold space for yourself and take the time to feel and heal yourself, because unresolved issues show up in ways, and we want you in this man space community. Coach Marston and I definitely want you to have a wonderful, safe place and space, and that starts with you.